Thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me. And I appreciate you diehard sticking around to hear what's new. I think it's worth just pausing for a second as I was listening to the last couple talks. That there's a fascinating convergence going on here that I think we'll continue to see. These are both lines of inquiry coming from curious people who are wanting to do better. On one hand, it's a surgeon who's concerned about doing better in his practice and asking questions. On the other hand, Dr. Ames' wonderful talk about more of an institutional approach and examining outcomes to come to some really powerful conclusions. My pedestrian prediction here is that these tools are going to become more common, and what's institutionalized will become more personalized for improvement for all of us. So with that backdrop, I want to talk about virtual clinical trials. Medicine, of course, is necessarily conservative. We're somewhat slow to embrace new technologies, but we're living through an era where tremendous change is happening for the benefits of patients as well as for the benefits of us practitioners. In addition to some of the things that we just talked about, there are shifts in the embracing of digital technologies and software as a therapeutics with new approvals that have just happened, data, artificial intelligence, aggregation of electronic medical records, machine learning, all for better diagnostic and better outcome understanding. And what I'd like to talk about is something that perhaps you've heard about, virtual clinical trials, which take advantage of mobile platforms and connected devices. Let's see, how do I do this?
Just click on the image.
Okay, I'll just do this. Clinical trials are in crisis, and many statistics go into this. A bottom line being that clinical trials are extremely expensive, unsustainably expensive to bring drugs to market, and some of the causes behind that are extremely low recruitment rates. Less than 5% of patients eligible for trials enroll. So think of it this way: our market penetration is less than 5%. In the clinical development industry. So, and that's more than just the need to develop drugs for the benefit of pharmaceutical companies. Patients who are in clinical trials receive better care. There is this thing called clinical care as clinical research as a care option, and it's documented particularly in oncology, but in other diseases, rare diseases, et cetera. Patients who are enrolled in clinical trials do receive better options. Another factor here is that the vast majority of people who enroll in clinical trials are, guess what? White males. That is just a reflection of the poor access of our healthcare system and being unable to incorporate diversity. Some of these other factors exist, such as the number of trials that shut down without, the number of sites that shut down without enrolling a single patient, and the low rate of success among clinical development. So, simultaneously, there's been a reaction and attempts to improve this. Let me just jump forward to wearable technologies have taken an increasing centralized role in healthcare. The number of wearable devices, connected devices, has dramatically improved. And in addition, the FDA has a demonstrated commitment to innovation that have created new pathways for data, software as a therapeutics, but also for mobile and wearable technologies. Backdrop. So this has led to an emerging area of so-called virtual clinical trials. And basically, what does that mean? It's a shift from the emphasis on the conduct of a clinical trial from sites and hospitals to connected devices, basically going direct to patients. So these trials come under different terminology: decentralized trials, mobile trials, direct-to-patient trials, siteless trials. But basically, the shift is taking the burden away from sites to patients. So why is that critical? Sites are busy. Hospitals are busy. I certainly don't have to tell you that. And that leads to a significant bottleneck in the ability to recruit patients. Back to those numbers that I talked about earlier, less than 5% eligible actually enroll in clinical trials. The global average for patient recruitment is half a patient per month for a clinical trial. That's the global average. So basically a couple patients per year. That means that many sites don't enroll anybody at a very high expense. Certainly some recruit a lot of patients, but many sites don't enroll patients. So that's a tremendous bottleneck that goes to the sites. The CRO industry, the clinical research organizations, are essentially focused on pushing patients through clinical sites. They're with study coordinators and CRAs and case managers essentially are going, their mission is essentially to meet with the nurses and the doctors at sites to try to urge them to recruit more patients. And various techniques have been tried, and still the number hovers at below 5%. So the move has now been proposed and now has been made to go from traditional trials, which are 100% site-dependent, towards hybrid trials and eventually to fully virtual trials. So I'm not going to propose that sometime in the near future there's going to be a dramatic shift to all virtual trials. I think what we will see, and already have seen, is a much greater uptick in so-called hybrid trials. And so a hybrid trial is really the embracing of mobile platforms to eliminate some office visits. And the trial then becomes a burden on the patient because of the number of times they have to come to the hospital, fill out forms, wait around, et cetera, et cetera. It really becomes a very unpleasant activity. They can't get paid for it other than reimbursement for travel and some nominal things. Unsurprising that our success rates are so low. So what we will probably see, and we're already seeing, is a dramatic uptick on this area in the middle. Hybrid trials, which eliminate the need for all site visits and really take it to mobile platforms that are already being used in dozens of other industries, banking, et cetera. Very secure, very common, and now we've moved into healthcare. But let's talk for a minute about these so-called virtual trials. Let me just jump through this. So this is not a completely new paradigm. The first virtual trials were initiated a decade ago. Science 37 is a private company that made a big splash and then has gone a little sideways and now is coming back. There's a number of companies now, but Science 37 was the pioneer, worked with Pfizer and some other organizations to initiate the first fully virtual models, defined as patient doesn't have to come into the hospital, doesn't have to come into the clinic, everything can be done from home. The early trials were mostly observational. Makes sense. That the first sort of experimentation in these techniques were things like topical formulations for acne, glucose monitoring, etc., and where both the devices or if there was an intervention were just delivered directly to home. So the early handful of trials were observational, but there's been somewhat of a failure of those early pioneers to come back and do further trials. So it became a little bit of a field of N of one. Each one of these, they did their virtual trial and they moved on to something else because there were some disappointments for some reason. Then the field changed. So we mentioned the Apple Watch. I know Dr. Ames actually had the Apple Watch in his talk. The Apple Watch was developed and it progressed incrementally to measure additional human parameters, not just activity steps, but it was the first device that was approved. It was the first smartwatch approved for the detection of abnormal cardiac rhythms, as well as a number of other things. Now it does a VO2 max setting, which is done by the same plethysmograph technology. So the Apple then did this landmark study called the Apple Heart Study. The thing that I'll focus on here that as somebody who works in the drug development industry, find somewhat remarkable is this number here. Over 400,000 participants enrolled in just a matter of months. That is something important for us to step back and say, well, how could they pull this off if our entire industry is enrolling half a patient per month? So it's a number of factors. Some of it, of course, comes from the brand name and the power of Apple. They enroll these patients directly through the phone. They actually did no advertising. It was just an option that you could get through the device. Some of it comes from the brand power of Apple, but much of it comes from these things that we have changed so slowly, or at least have become part of our lives, that we take it somewhat for granted. The ability to have smartphones, connected data, and connected devices, we all take for granted. And that's changed over the last 10 years. So just to pause on what the findings here were, the findings weren't very dramatic. Basically, they confirmed the ability of this diagnostic sensor, mobile diagnostic sensor, to detect AFib. Now, I won't get into there's a lot of published sort of debate and controversy over whether this is accurate or not, or whether this is a waste of time or not. That's not the point. Again, for me, the point is 400,000 patients enroll. It confirms that a virtual study going from the observational era to the pragmatic era. So these are looking at real-world situations to determine these effects. Got the attention of the world's largest healthcare company, J&J. Janssen created a collaboration with Apple, which then initiated in the next logical step, an observational pragmatic study that records outcomes. This is called the Heartline study, which is about to kick off. Looking at AFib diagnostics and then stroke outcomes with the goal of enrolling 150,000 patients in this trial, and for a 2-year engagement. And the outcome here will be looking at the observed outcome, the well-documented outcome, relationship of AFib and stroke, but in this case, can digital interventions through education, monitoring, et cetera, change that outcome? Really a very interesting, fascinating thing for these companies to do. And why are they doing this? There is a public health benefit that's occurring, but also a practical benefit. The next stage, which has been recently announced, is a fully virtual interventional trial. Now, Invokana is SGLT2, not a 3. It's a sodium glucose loop transporter inhibitor that has been approved for diabetes. This class of drugs has been shown to have a strong effect in diabetes, and impressively, these class of drugs called gliflozins have also demonstrated a very positive effect in heart failure. Initially, heart failure in diabetics, but now the first drugs have just gone through clinical trials and are about to get relabeled for patients with heart failure, with or without diabetes. Really a dramatic change in the toolbox that's we have for pharmacology and heart failure. And then we talked about connected devices. So several months ago, J&J announced the first fully virtual interventional trial. It's called the CHIEF trial, and it happens at the right time. There's an FDA mindset shift, not just with connected devices, but this is a guidance that came out last year that the FDA will approve drugs on heart failure based on symptoms without a favorable effect on mortality. Shocking. I was shocked when I read that. But it really goes to the mission of the FDA of approving drugs on the basis of way that patients feel, function, as well as survive. So the outcome being used here is a patient-reported outcome called the Cardiac City Questionnaire. It's being put on a mobile platform. 2,000 patients will be enrolled in this study. It's a fully placebo-controlled trial, and if this has the hope is that this will demonstrate that this convergence of technology, now that we've moved forward, will bend the curve in drug development and reduce some of those costs. So I think it gives us good reason to be optimistic. Thank you very much.